with today. Yeah, Michelle, that sounds good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for joining part 2 of CTJM's. Oh, sorry, I think there was something messed up with my audio. Okay, sorry. But yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for joining CTJM's Education for Liberation event part 2. Last week on Saturday, we had a panel with organizers from Village Leadership Academies, Change the Name campaign. We had bird torture survivor Anthony also with us, and youth organizer Destiny Harris from Cops Out CPS, and 2 teachers from CPS who have experience teaching the Reparations 1 curriculum. So for this week, we have Silvia with us today, who's an artist and educator, and will be leading a digital arts workshop. So I'll pass it over to Silvia.
All right, so good morning, everybody. I hope this is not too different from my classroom, but I really hope that people will participate. This is a participatory-based workshop, and I'm really looking forward to going through the process of how I create work that's rapid response work that really looks at hyperlocal history to educate and advocate for the different grassroots movement work here in the city. So with that being said, I want to start off today just by talking a little bit about who I am and what I do. So I am Silvia Gonzalez, and I work at Franklin Fine Arts Center. I am a K-8 fine arts, visual arts teacher, and I'm also a CTU union delegate for my school. And aside from having that connection to working with young people in Chicago public schools, I am also part of the Chicago ACT Collective, which I see Yvonne is also on this call. It's a group of us, about 16 or 18 of us, that get together and talk about the issues that are affecting our communities and create artwork that is responsive to that as a collective. But we also just really think about what it means to be engaged in collective care and what transformation looks like from a very interpersonal level. And so I'm really excited about how those different identities that I take on inform my practice as an educator and inform my practice as also an artist. I would like to get a sense of who's here. If you could name who you are, if you work at a school, what school you work at, or any information that you are happy to share. And then there's one prompt that I would like for us to think through, which is this idea around when do we feel most free? What makes you feel free? So I'm actually going to share my tab so that, you know, if you forget the prompts, you can see them. So would anyone like to get started today so we can go through some introductions and know who's in the room? Can people hear me? I don't know if people can hear, or if maybe people are just being really shy. I could just keep going if people are feeling a little nervous to speak.
And hi, Sylvia, I'll jump on. My name's Yvonne. At MS, I work at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is a kind of school, but obviously not K through 12. In terms of what makes me feel free, I think, you know, those moments when sort of organizing with others. I'm also part of Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, so that's been a project that has helped me to feel connected to folks, especially folks connected to and impacted by police violence, and sort of working with them and with others to find healing and liberation for them has been great. So I think that's certainly a moment, and I think art helps do that.
Thanks, Yvonne. All right, so I'm gonna keep it going because I do kind of want to go through some content, and I'm not sure if people want to share as we go along, you're more than welcome to share. But that sort of takes me to a little bit more of my practice. So aside from working in CPS, I also have my own artist practice. And for me, when I think about freedom, I think about how we contextualize what we know and what we imagine, right? So for me, when I think about this concept of freedom, when I think about this concept of collective liberation, I think of collective joy, and I think of the moments that bring us that vision for that future we want to hold for ourselves with others. So I find that for me, collage is a really great practice to give myself an opportunity to literally take images of what I that I collect, and then create a new image from that has a little bit of imagination embedded within it. And so these are two examples of some of the collage work that I've done. I also kind of wanted to talk about digital collage, especially for teachers that are currently doing a lot of remote learning and teaching. Digital collage has also really liberated the type of imagery that I find. It's a little bit more it's a little bit easier to find imagery that I can recontextualize because I'm not necessarily searching in a limited magazine or finding images serendipitously. I'm sort of being more intentional about what I'm creating and how I'm remixing that to create a different context. And so that being said, if your students are, or the folks that you work with are really interested in combining the two, like the drawing or the finding of the images and then adding text, these are some examples of works that I've created in the past that I've taken from scanning some of my drawings or finding imagery online and just repeating and using that sense of repetition to create imagery and text to contextualize what it is I'm trying to create for a message. So today's workshop is really going to be about introducing some of these ideas, collecting data that resonates with whatever messaging you want to get out. In this particular workshop, we're going to be talking about the Reparations 1 curriculum. And then towards the end, I'm going to do a step-by-step sort of process on how I put these images together and how you can do that process with students even as you are engaging in remote learning and teaching. What I've really enjoyed about the process that I've been talking about is that I can play around with color, I can play around with design choices, and that allows me to create multiples of something. And so I'm able to sort of, if I want to take it off of the digital format, you know, what I've done in the past is I've taken that and created a screen to do screen printing with it. And I found that to be really, I don't know, it just brings me a lot of joy to be able to really think about how my process changes as my medium changes. And that's something that you can also talk about with students is what changes when you change your format, what changes when you change your color. And those are all really exciting conversations to have on a more formal level. But I think that once you have your basic elements of the data and the messaging and what type of content you want to create, a lot of that just becomes part of that process. With that, I've also gotten really into creating infographics for different folks that are doing grassroots work in Chicago. This was created for CTU and for different folks that were organizing around cops out of CPS. So what I did was I asked a friend, Sarah G, if I could take one of her photographs and remix it so that I could also create content that would then also share information for folks to be aware of. So these are sort of like these infographic type of digital media pieces that a lot of folks will often take and share to social media to campaign around something. The second one is image credit to Nicole Marroquin, who borrowed that original image from Howard D. Simmons, the photographer for Froebel events in June of 1973. And so I took her remixed image and then added text to it so that, again, people could be more aware of some of the data in collaboration with some kind of image that really pops and has that moment where people can read, clearly try to read some of this information. And so that's something that I wanted to talk about in today's workshop too, is what is the purpose of what you're creating and how can we get our students to really think about intention behind the work that we create, but also what is our source, right? Like, where are we getting this information from? Where are we getting the images from? How do we properly credit our sources? These are some that I also created. Instead of having data, just having a clear messaging for folks to share on social media. We want counselors in clean schools, not cops. And so I'm just showing you some, different types of images that I've created, whether they were drawn, scanned, or done digitally, so that you can think about what processes you might want to engage with young people or what processes you might want to engage yourself in. So I want to actually head on over to the Chicago Torture website, but I also want to talk about, here, let me see if I can share that. I wanted to also talk about some of the work that the ACT Collective has also created. How do I, here, I think I do it like this. There we go. Am I sharing the Chicago ACT Collective now, Michelle? Yes? No? Okay, I'm gonna hope that I'm sharing the Chicago ACT Collective website, but I wanted to share this too because I had earlier talked about that collective ability to create together and to print together or to create messaging together. That's something that you can also incorporate with remote learning and teaching. You might maybe, instead of having an individual student create a poster or a graphic, have a small group of students work together to create some kind of messaging. And so maybe part of that could also be looking at different collectives in Chicago that have done work that's critical or that looks at the history of our city through a more critical lens, through questioning or through community organizing efforts. And with that, you can also teach young people about the importance and the value of collective organizing. From my understanding, it's been quite a few years in the making for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials to really have the campaign that they're having now. And I actually wanted to head on over to the website so that that can start to inform what we're going to get through for the workshop today. So let me click on the new share. Let me see, I think if I do it like that. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial website, which is what I used as a website to grab content from. And right now I'm looking at the timeline with you all. This is one of the processes that you can also take with your students. I know that there is a curriculum for Reparations 1 for high school, as well as a Reparations 1 for middle school. I think that that curriculum that's already been created for you to teach from can also work in conjunction with looking at the website together and looking at the data together, looking at timelines, thinking about how timelines work as a historical document to really understand how long it takes to do this collective work and why. Why does it take this long? How does the law work in conjunction with policing in our city? and to continue to have those critical conversations around policing. So what I did when I started my own graphic was I looked at the history of the campaign, and I was able to find all of these different images along with the history of it. So in 2004, Attorney Standish Willis and Black People Against Police Torture proposed these cases to be raised in international forums, and later proposed the idea of reparations in the Burge torture cases. So that's like the very beginning is of this particular case. And then if you scroll down, all the way down, I also looked at the last thing that was posted, May 6, 2015, Chicago City Council unanimously passes the reparation legislation and becomes the first municipality in the US to provide reparations for racially motivated law enforcement violence. So some of this could be put into a context so that you can really see that in a graphic through design. The other thing I looked at for this was this, I mean, I looked at the entire website, to be honest, but I also looked at statement on 2020 police violence. I also looked at, let me double check if I can actually instead share this one. Here we go. I also looked at this part of the website because on this part of the website, there are also testimonials of survivors of the cases. And I'll show you in a second how I took some of this data to create infographics. All right, so that being said, if everyone could follow along, it's a little hard to know if people are gonna, well, I'll just share. So I went on spark.adobe.com. So if you're there and you wanna give this a try, hop on sparkadobe.com for the step-by-step process. But the way that I think about doing this type of work with students is step number one, I want them to become familiar with the content. So that's where I feel like the Reparations 1 curriculum for high school and middle school becomes really applicable. Having those conversations with students around vocabulary terms, around historical timelines and data, around information of cases, around what is police violence in our communities, what's police violence locally, how is that connected? Maybe if you want to even expand that conversation, in what ways is police violence and torture related to surveillance or related to the prison industrial complex, and then take them on over to the website so that they can pick up specific data that relates to the Chicago cases here. So once you have all of that, once you've gone sort of through that process of familiarizing students with the content, I would suggest allowing or giving students the space to experiment with Adobe Spark. So if you're not familiar with Adobe Spark, it's this website that's actually free. I mean, the only thing is it'll sometimes keep the watermark on the bottom for it being Spark Adobe. But I wanted to show you some different examples of infographics so that you could kind of have a template to think through, but also when you're doing this with students, continue that conversation quite critically. So that's going to bring me on back to this slide. So when you're finding data with students, I would recommend keeping that pretty simple and to the point, maybe doing bullet points with them, or you could also find some of the data that you want them to work through and create a list for them to start off from. So if they're kind of lost and they're like, I have no idea where to start, having something ready for them to work off of might really help. So this is where I had imagined that we would all work together to find some points on the Chicago Torture Justice website and start adding them into the boxes and maybe organizing that information. But how you organize that information can also really help in your effectiveness and not getting lost in all of it. So one way that I do that is to tell students that when you're brainstorming, you're looking for data, you're looking for quotes, you're looking for readable material, or you're providing a prompt. So when you are starting something that is data-based or an infographic or a graphic in general, the way that I think about that process is, what is the purpose of this work? Am I working with someone to make a demand? Am I making a demand? Am I hoping to inspire a group of people? The first question that I started off this workshop with was, what's a time that you felt free? What makes you feel free? In what moments do you feel free? So if you're prompting people to participate and collaborate with you, are you trying to inspire them? If you're not trying to inspire them, are you trying to advocate and teach? Are you providing people with information that they may or may not be aware of, that is happening in their own city? Or are you trying to remind people or yourself remember something that's important, something that you believe is something that we shouldn't forget? And so when I was invited to do this workshop, I was really thinking about that concept of a memorial, right? What is it that we want to remember? What stories do we believe should not be forgotten? Who gets to decide what those stories are? How do we make the marginalized stories front and center? How do we reclaim our own power to create that type of context for ourselves? So all of that, right, can even fit together. You could be, in a sense, memorializing information through a graphic while making a demand. But I really want to sort of expand that idea of memorializing and why that's so critical to our history, what we choose to memorialize, what becomes important, how do we advocate for that, what are we teaching, are we trying to inspire, or are we making a demand? And one thing I tell students is that it's a lot like writing an essay. What's the purpose? Identifying that can be helpful, but it's not totally necessary. And as people go along, it gets a lot easier through that process. So once I get students to think about that beginning, middle, end, or inspire, demand, advocate, remember, I think that sort of helps students to start to imagine, okay, well, I want to inspire and I want my message to be personal, or I want to make a demand and I want it to, I want to share this data with people while I'm making a demand. So let me go back to the Spark website and get us started on the step-by-step. Before I go to that, does anyone have any questions or comments so far before I hop on Spark? Okay, I'm gonna just hop on Spark. Let me click on this. Okay. And Michelle, can you, am I sharing the right page? Does it look like the Spark website? Michelle?
We can see it, Maestra Silvia.
Okay, gracias, maestro. All right, so let me keep on going. So I have prepared a few different examples. This is the very first one. Does it say, is it loading? Can you guys see if it's loading? I just want to know if I have to keep switching tabs or not.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so this first infographic that I created for this workshop, I thought it might be important to have the definition of torture, a statement of a survivor, and some overview data to get people started, right? Like what were the John Birch torture cases? Why is reparations one an important thing for us to think about? Why should we create a memorial, and for who? And then when I finished making this, I thought, yeah, this would make an interesting part of a book or a leaflet or maybe even a poster. But when I took a closer look at it, I was like, there's a lot of text here. And if I'm posting this to social media, I guarantee people will gloss over it if they're not that interested in the content. So that's something that you can have a conversation with your students and then ask them, how would you split up the composition? That's sort of where you can have more of those technical conversations with students. So for me, whenever I'm teaching social justice content work, there's kind of like a fine balance between teaching the content, like the actual work around the reparations one curriculum. And then there's also this like other half to it, right? The like elements of art, the principles of art. How do you create something that's readable? What colors are you using? What gets lost? And so you can get into the more specifics of design. With that being said, I will also say that I'm planning on doing this particular unit with middle school students in the spring, which is when most teachers are working through the John Birch Reparations 1 curriculum. So that being said, this is the first maybe introduction to what I started creating, and then having those conversations around, well, this is great information, all amazing data, really important stuff, but it will get lost. And if we're talking about accessibility with our students, which we should, talking about how copying and pasting this text into a post so that it can be read instead of just have it be an image that can't be translated. That's something that I also talk about with students, and how that just becomes a lot of text, right? So let me show you the other post that I made, where I took the same, and the cool thing about Spark is you can take the same template and repurpose it or recreate it or fix it. You don't have to start from scratch, and I'll show you the step-by-step of how to begin one, but I just wanted to show you some examples first. So here I have the essay, if you will, right? Like the first part with the title. So I have the title at the top. I have the definition, and I have overview and data. So what is this even about? How do we define torture? And like, what information is the most critical to understand the overview of the situation? So I feel like this one is probably a better infographic to go with. I don't think that the styling of the graphic works as well as when it became sort of like this bigger thing, but with more information. But I do think that breaking down information like this, even with students, might help them understand the importance of clarity. And then lastly, I did another one, totally changed the style, and sort of had like the definition vaguely behind the more important information. So torture, the definition, which gives us like the most important parts of it, the title, and then the one overview point. So as a graphic on say social media, if we were to share this, I do think this would be the most impactful. Maybe, I mean, I don't know, you all can debate that with me. But I think because the color is bold and there's no, like, it's easy to read, the title is really large, the overview of the cases is sort of highlighted. I mean, I would almost debate that maybe that needs to be a little bit bigger, but the definition, we don't totally need to read it. If we really wanted to, we could Google it, look it up, but just to have that information there in place can also be helpful. So thinking with students around how are we using color, how are we making clear, concise points, how are we summarizing information, and what role does all of that play in art, and how do artists create these messages that can then be shared with a wider public? So let me show you the step-by-step. I started a template already over here that we could borrow, change the colors if we wanted to, obviously change the title, and then change these dates to match up with some of the things on the timeline on the website. But I wanted to show you step number very one. So step number very one, spark.adobe.com. You can sign in with your CPS account or your personal account. I have two. I don't really know why, but I do. And then you can create this, you can click on this plus sign to create a project, and it'll open up these options for you. So are you creating a flyer, a story, a post, so on and so forth. You can also go to the home page and that'll pop up for you already in that pre-made format, so you can kind of imagine what that's going to look like. So for this, because a lot of the time I create rapid response work that I know will be shared on social media, I typically work with the Instagram post option because that's the one that people use the most. That's where I'm finding the demand is the highest. And that also kind of helps me, something about that square format, square-ish format, and something about that like smaller scale kind of makes me, as a designer or as an artist, really think about what is the most important thing. And the cool thing about Instagram now is that you can create like where you can swipe to the right and it's not just the one square, there's like multiple squares in one post. So you can also talk about that with students, is you don't have to put it all in one. You can create multiple Instagram posts or multiple swipes to get people to really understand what you're saying. So, oops, I clicked on the wrong one, my bad. Let me go back. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on Instagram post. Before I start this, does anyone have any questions on Adobe Spark or anything that I've talked about so far? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna keep going. Over on the right-hand side, you have Spark templates that you can choose from that are already pre-made for you to work through. Or you can also search Spark templates. You can look at social graphic and see what comes up if any of this speaks to you. You can type up infographic and it'll show you some examples of this is the template I remixed, the private versus public, and then I made it square and then I changed the colors. So that would be a good start. Anything that has a little flag over it is premium. And if you got it like that, that's great. Otherwise, I just use any and all of the free options. So I'm going to start, let's start with something that's not too busy. Maybe I can show you the process for this one. So you click on a template and what you'll notice is that sometimes it resizes to that template. So I head on over to the right side. So the right side is where you have all of your tools. I click on the right side and I click on resize, and I'm gonna search for the Instagram square format. And so there it sort of like reformats it for me. And then I can start to play around with the different objects that are pre-assembled into the content. As you can see, I didn't move it a whole bunch for the one that I created for this workshop, but you can move things around and switch it up. You can click on an object and just click delete and it gets rid of it for you. If there's something you don't like that you don't want to use, you can just get rid of it. Once you click in the text box twice, it opens up for you to type in any information and data. So for example, this is where for students, I would have some pre-selected information that you want them to work with. Maybe that could be their first project is just becoming familiar with Spark. And then for their second project, you can have them create a campaign for the Reparations 1 curriculum and information you go through. And if you have them do that, then they have to go back to the website or go back to other sources to find information around the Reparations 1 case. But that's sort of maybe one part of that project. Could also be research that information, find 3 quotes and 3 sources of data and paste it in a slideshow. And then you can say, go to Spark and create an infographic, or go to Spark and create a social media, a postable social media content, so on and so forth. Those are just some ideas that I'm thinking through as I work through creating the curriculum that I'm going to teach young people when I implement this. So let me just go through the other options that you have on here. So as soon as I click on the text, it opens up different options for me. I can change the font. And man, listen, I actually did a Adobe Spark like lesson plan in the beginning of the year because I want to get them comfortable with digital media. You could have a whole lesson on typography alone. There's a lot of really beautiful videos on typefaces and the history of typography that you could share with young people so that they're being very conscious around the choices that they're making. Or you can keep it really simple and talk to them about what's legible, what isn't, what's beautiful but doesn't quite work with the messaging. Like, would I use Josefina Josephine slab regular type font to type in the John Burgess torture cases? Probably not, because it's not appropriate. So really thinking about what makes something appropriate versus not, what makes something readable, and how to make those very intentional choices around readability for accessibility, or readability over your own style. Like, this isn't necessarily totally about your infographic. This is about how will the public perceive this, and how can I make it very clear for the public to perceive this while maybe still maintaining some of my own aesthetic. I hope that makes sense. Over on the right-hand side, when you click on text, you can also have an effect behind, well, that's not going to show. You can have an effect behind the text that'll sort of emphasize it some more. I mean, honestly, the best way to teach Adobe Spark, if y'all know young people, is to just let young people experiment and let them flop and fail a few times, which is why I was suggesting that for their first assignment, you give them some content to work with. And so have them play around with fonts, have them play around with scale and size, have them play around with these different options. So that is for text. You double click, it opens up a box, it opens up this right-hand side for figuring out what you can do with your text. The other thing that you can do is change your colors, and if you don't want to work too hard, you can just keep clicking the arrow until it gives you a color palette that you like, or even within the color palette, you can shuffle those colors until you get something that you like. Or for me, if I go back to that first template that I was using, instead of just shuffling through colors, I started thinking, well, what are the colors of Chicago? When I think of Chicago, what do I think of? And the easy answer, if you're not trying to rack your brain too much, is, well, the Chicago flag colors, or the colors that we see on the police cars, or the colors even of the website that I'm looking at as a source for the work, right? Like the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials uses a lot of black and red and gray. The actual videos use blue. So how can you incorporate some of that already pre-made ideas to fit this larger like portfolio of ideas? So I'm actually trying to go back to my projects so you all can see some of the decisions that I took. So here you can see with the John Birch data number 2, the one that has a little bit less text, I was thinking about the Chicago flag. And so I use kind of like that teal because it's more of a baby blue, I guess, but you can sort of play around with that until you get the colors that you really feel like will work with what you're working on. Actually, that does look a little nicer. So now I have content that's fitting within a context. And without making it too obvious. Like, I'm not gonna splash in here the picture of the Chicago flag to make a point. Although I could, or I could use that as a symbol somehow, but you know, I feel like right now what's more important is making the case or the point on this very particular title definition data, those 3 points. So I actually wanted to stop there and see if anybody had any questions on this process or if anyone wanted me to show them something specific or in particular. Otherwise, I was kind of hoping that participants would work with me and work with me through this workshop to create some of their own content. The idea was that hopefully you all would also be following step by step. Okay. Yeah, it'd be kind of nice to see some of y'all. This is feeling too much like the classroom, you know, where like I'm teaching and like it's just like their name. So please, you know, if you have questions, that's sort of what this panel workshop is for.
Thank you so much. I apologize about my timing, but I love what you just presented, and I actually have never heard of Adobe Spark. And so this is such a great tool to use with my students as well. So the question that I had is, what are some of the questions that students have asked you in like troubleshooting this program? Like, what are some of the like challenges, or what are some of the ways that students have like navigated engaging with this tool?
The very first lesson that I taught with this, again, like understand I'm teaching this to middle school. We're in remote learning, and it already has a lot of challenges. I didn't get a lot of questions, but in my feedback to them after they submitted their assignments, I was able to talk about, you know, you can't forget your elements of art, right? Like make sure that this is legible. We got to make sure people can read what you're writing, what you're typing. So for me, I think that it was more like they were just interested in playing. They were interested in a lot of the different templates. I think one thing that I would say is it's really easy to get lost in all of the templates. So maybe advising your students to have a specific thing that they're looking for in mind. So like I typed in the very beginning infographic because I knew that there were a lot of templates for me to look through. And I also knew that I had a very particular idea in mind. When you go to the search box for templates, you can also search maybe infographic, or you can search data, or you can like just one word that might help guide the process of the template you're going to choose from. You can also start with a blank, just a blank canvas, and do whatever your heart desires. But you know, that might work for students that don't like the templates, that feel kind of like that actually freezes them up some more. But I find that a lot of the time students prefer the template because then they're not sort of like sitting in front of this blank canvas wondering what to do.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, we have till 12, right? I just want to make sure, because I'm pretty close to be like, I feel like I'm, unless people have anything else they want me to talk about, I don't really know what else to cover.
Sylvia, I had a question, if you don't mind me asking. How do you deal with introducing this conversation to students, parents, administrations that might push back on teaching, even though this is part of the CPS curriculum?
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna be real. This year is gonna be the first year that I do this project, and I have talked with our social science teacher about doing like a collaborative lesson. And I think that if you plan on not doing this alone, it's just a lot easier. I mean, I have done social justice themed work with students before, and I just I just sort of do it, and then you know, if they have something to say, then we can have a conversation. But I'm not going to apologize for work that is important for students to be aware of, and for histories that for so long have not been taught, too long have not been taught, which for me as a teacher, I sort of have this moment where I'm like, that's a huge problem if it's not being taught. Well, there's a reason why police violence and police genocide has existed in our city for so long, because those narratives are either literally tucked under the rug or dismissed or excused. But what happens when we use education? What happens when we use this powerful, huge curriculum that was won as part of the reparations demand? Like, to me, that is huge. And it's going to be tough. It's never easy to do this work, but I do think, like, if you approach it from the lens of this is education work proposed and approved by CPS, this is part of their curriculum in the spring anyway, I think, there's not much else to be said. My approach with general social justice work is I want to also know the story of students within that. I also want to turn the lens back and really have those conversations. I remember even last year before we had to, not be in the building, I was doing a lesson around what makes our community safe, when have we felt safe, what makes our communities great, what are some things that we wish were accessible to our communities. And students were making these really beautiful like games that were like made out of cardboard, and like they were making their own game pieces and coming up with their own rules and systems. And we had a conversation around police and communities, and we had a conversation around police don't make everybody safe. Who do they make feel safe and who do they not make feel safe? And what could be in place of that? Like what? And then that's sort of where we start having those conversations around care, not cops, right? What does care for our communities look like? Because I think honestly, we have to really talk about these difficult histories in our city, but I also want to challenge us to not just focus on that. I want to challenge us to be kind of like what I said in the beginning of the presentation, is to imagine beyond that, right? Like, how do we imagine beyond that? What are the words and the frames that we're using? So if we're saying care, not cops, and we know that the police have really no place with our young people, then what is in place of that? How do we deal with harm? How do we deal with when people are hurt? What do we do when there's a situation that feels like it's too much for us to handle? And really simplifying that and allowing students to have the space to talk. I had students who were saying, well, maybe if we didn't have like cops, we could afford to open up gyms to families so that they wouldn't have to pay and they could go exercise. And I was just like, yeah, because if our bodies and our minds are well, doesn't that kind of like over time equate with like a different kind of wellness? So I think, I don't know if that answered your question, Maestro, but for me, sometimes it's like, I'm gonna just do it. I'm gonna just do it and not be so scared, and really have those conversations from the place of data, but also from the place of what's your personal narrative? What's your take on this? How do you feel about it? Because honestly, if we don't do it, who will? And that's why I also think that the work that the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials is doing to create a memorial for survivors is so critical. Because if we have that in our city, that is like a visual that allows us to see the history, but also allows us to begin to think about, how do we imagine beyond this? And already we have one answer. We start teaching about it. The fact that the curriculum was one, again, is a huge deal, right? So I hope that kind of helps. Once I get on my soapbox, it's hard to like get off of it a little bit. So in conclusion, I will be teaching this in the spring, and I'll let you know how it goes.
Gracias, maestra.
Okay, cool. Another thing too is looking at other sources that have compiled this data, right? Like We Charge Genocide has a lot of information online. Looking at how, the Zen Education Project, how have they looked at these difficult histories that are often not taught in schools? So for me, sometimes if I'm not comfortable with something, I might even ask the ACT Collective, like, yo, I'm thinking about this. What would your approach be? Ask the people that are already involved in that from the community, at the community level, or look up templates of other folks that have done similar work, and work off of that.
And Master Silvia, thanks so much. One other place that I think can be useful for people to check out in that same vein, and that actually CTJM is part of now, with a beautiful design by Monica Trinidad, is the Celebrating People's History.
Mm-hmm.
There's a poster there about the reparations campaign, and obviously a lot of other projects and posters about similar kinds of efforts and wins and struggles. And I think that can be really inspiring to students, both in terms of the design, because there's certainly some amazing posters in there, and also just in terms of that education piece that you're talking about. And so that's, I think, another good resource, and was created in a way because of that, right, to inspire students. And as a reminder, actually, to those students, that a lot of the pieces in there are by folks in high school. And so, not to be afraid to know that they can do something similar as well in terms of their own designs. I think that's another good place to turn to.
Somebody, or Patricia, typed in the chat box the justseeds.org, reparations now, reparations one. Yeah, definitely using other artists' work within the same vein, or the direct same vein, I think really helps students think about what it is that they want to create and how they want to create. And because this is such hyperlocal specific history, looking at specific hyperlocal artists that have done work around this, looking at For the People Artist Collective, I saw that Patricia just put that in the chat box, looking at even Damon Locke's, right? Looking at the work of PNAP, Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, looking at the work of the 96 Acres Project, looking at the work of the Chicago ACT Collective, looking at the work that even, Yvonne and Maestro William have done around this, looking at Patricia's work. Like, I don't think there's any harm in referencing ourselves or referencing each other, even though we're friends, because we're thinking about this, we're doing this work. And so I used to really shy away from bringing some of my work into the classroom, because I know that sometimes it's a little bit political, but also very personal. But I've realized that the more that I talk to students about my practice, the more that they see themselves as capable, and like, it's not this like far out idea. In fact, it's helping them see, like, oh, my teacher does this, I can probably do it too. And it makes the work more accessible. And I think that's sort of kind of like destructures the way we think about art and the way we think about design. It makes it accessible. And if we can make the work accessible to our students and to the folks that we're trying to reach, I think that's probably one of the most important things. Okay, well, we're at 12:03. I think that's time.
We have, I think, until 12:30, but if that's all, then feel free.
Yeah, I feel like that's what I had prepared. I feel like the 30-minute would have been cushioned with like other folks' designs or other folks' thoughts and ideas, but it seems kind of like a quieter group. So I feel pretty good, unless people have other questions or comments. Thanks, Sophie. That feedback helps. I'm glad it was helpful and that you have something you can take back to your students.
Cool. If that's all, yeah, thanks everyone for coming to this part 2 of CCJM's event series. Make sure you follow our social media. It's like Justice Memorial or Chicago Torture for most of our handles to stay updated on what we have upcoming next. And yeah, and feel free to reach out to any of us. I'm sure you have the Justice Memorial's email at least, I think, because that was like what the webinar was gone through. So if you have any questions or concerns or just like want to further collaborate, like definitely feel free to reach out.
I would also say if you end up making any infographics with your students or any of these designs, to share it with CTJM, to hashtag it to @CTJM on social media, so that, you know, we can keep the conversation going, and also let our city know that our young people are thinking about this and they're using their voices and their artwork to advocate for what we want to see in our city. Cool. All right. Well, everybody take care.